Bienvenidos todos, welcome everybody, and I am really delighted to have this conversation tonight because we are going to be discussing not only about films but also about literary works, not only comic books. Don't worry, we're going to be discussing about different kinds of storytellings, and for this I am delighted to present tonight's guest, Paul Constant. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm just fine, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure. If you know him, well, he's a famous author right now. He's going to become millionaire after a movie based on one of his works. It's finally released, and we had a wonderful time when we talked with him for the Stripando show, which is focused mainly on comic books. And that's you can go and watch that interview. That's focused mainly on that title. We will mention something about that. But Paul, you are not just a comic writer. You actually write about a lot of things, right?
I do. It's true. I got my start in journalism. I got my start as a bookseller, and then I worked at an independent bookstore in Seattle for 8 years, and then I started writing literary criticism for a local newspaper, and they hired me. It was a paper called The Stranger. Mm-hmm. They hired me to be their books editor, but I like to write quickly, and I write a lot, and so I wound up doing everything. I wrote restaurant reviews, but I did quite a lot of film reviews also. So.
Yeah, and actually, just right before we started with this transmission, Paul was confessing some of his secrets, and you can actually check some of his film reviews that we will discuss perhaps a little bit later. But you were also a machine. You were a mean machine criticizing food and...
It's true, yeah. They called me the sandwich editor because I had strong opinions about sandwiches, and so I wrote a lot of restaurant reviews, but more than anything, I reviewed books and movies for The Stranger for about 8 years. So I have hundreds of movie reviews. We have an enormous film festival here in Seattle called SIFF, the Seattle International Film Festival. So I reviewed it. We'd have hundreds of movies every year, and I would watch 50 or 60 in the span of 3 weeks to get our guide all together before the festival. So.
Yeah, and for those familiar, well, actually, here in Churros y Palomitas, which is the main site where we're publishing here, we also go to some festivals. Well, obviously, here in Mexico, we don't have enough budget, but now that you mentioned, perhaps I will let me save some to go to Seattle and see how is the international selection in there. And actually, you can watch some of the selection. The festival, it's on December for the looks of it, right?
No, the festival's in May, but they have year-round cinemas. They have one theater with one big theater, and then they have another theater with 3 small screens, and then another theater with a very small screen. So they're a year-round organization. It's pretty amazing. It's really remarkable.
That's quite a lot of works, and as you mentioned, that's remarkable. But okay, let's go back to the topic, and this is something that I wanted to discuss because, for example, for the people who are movie fans. Right now, we have an ease in communication at this very moment, and it's really easy to publish something that you wrote. Perhaps if you want to do an audio show, a video show like the one that we're doing right now, it's really easy just to either write or record something and publish it and have an opinion. And as we know, everybody has an opinion about everything, which is not always something really convenient. But
right.
If you want to analyze, if you want to do criticism, there are perhaps some guidelines that are not spoken because there are not a lot of places like official, at least in Mexico, and perhaps you can bring some light to this topic about the panorama in the United States. But there is actually not like a proper school or like a proper institution that tells you how to do criticism, how to review a film. Yes, we have perhaps workshops for film appreciation, which can help a little bit. But however, there are different elements that you have to take in account when you are reviewing. And in this case, at least with you, Paul, you have experience in 3 different topics. For example, when you are reviewing a book or perhaps when you are asking for some of the writers that work with you about the review of a book, what are some of the main aspects that you think should be taken into account?
Well, one of the things I think the reason that it was so lucky for me to start as a book critic was because literary criticism is the only form of criticism where you're responding to the art form in the art form itself. You know what I mean? Like, you are writing a piece of writing in response to a piece of writing. You don't dance a dance performance review. You know, you don't make a movie as a criticism of a movie. So, because I was writing about writers, I wanted to make sure that my writing was at least was pretty good, right? You don't want to be a bad writer and say this book is written badly. So so I had to make sure I avoided a lot of cliches and you know, just sort of boring phrases. I wanted the writing to be really strong. So because if you tell a writer they wrote something bad and they can write back and say, well, you misspelled imagination in your review, then you're going to feel like a jerk. So I think writing about books helped me learn that you need to have something original to say. One of the things I find in film reviews is it's very easy to fall back into cliches, into things that everybody says. You know, like, you don't want to say, you know, Martin Scorsese has done it again or something like that. You know, it's like it's because everybody can publish their opinions, so you have to have something worthwhile in your opinion. You have to have something to say. And I think a lot of people talk about movies, but not many people have something to say.
There you have it. And as we mentioned before, well, there's actually a famous phrase, a famous quote. Well, it's not exactly a quote, that everybody has, that opinions are like ours, I think, ourselves. Everybody has one, and, they all stink. And that's one of the things that, for example, if you are looking at this very moment for one of the latest films, for example, The Irishman, since you mentioned Martin Scorsese, and he has been mentioned by people who love his films and from people who are not exactly fans of his works, but I'm pretty sure that they haven't actually watched any of his films. But for example, there you have a lot of opinions, and if you go to places like YouTube, just to mention one example, you will find pretty much everybody telling you about the history of his films, which can be interesting, or perhaps just like saying that The Irishman is very long, The Irishman is something that shouldn't be promoted because it's not the kind of content, or perhaps the Irishman, it's an excellent piece of work, but most of these, as you mentioned, are just opinions. For example, in this case, we are dealing not just with opinions. There are different elements that you have to take in account, as we were mentioning before. But for example, if in literary work, as you mentioned, you have to at least write correctly and make sense with the things that you are writing, because you are complaining, you are criticizing, or you are worshipping, if you allow me to use that term, and the work of somebody else. Is there a difference between the kind of criticism that you can write about written work when you compare it with a different kind of work, in this case films or perhaps sandwiches?
You know, I think that I don't know if there's that much of a difference. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from a different place when I'm reviewing a movie, because I've never made a movie, and you know, my comic book was bought for an adaptation, but I don't think I'm ever going to, you know, direct a movie or anything like that. So I'm obviously coming from a different place than as somebody who's written thousands and thousands of words, enough to fill, you know, books over and over again. But I think that part of the reason why I like writing so much, and why I write so much, I write all the time, is because I'm sort of figuring out what I think about the thing as I write about it. You know what I mean? I'm deciding my feelings on the thing on the screen as I'm writing. And and I think I approach them all sort of the same way. I think that what makes a good review interesting is context. And for some reviewers, that might mean, what is, again, to use The Irishman as an example, what does The Irishman mean compared to some of Scorsese's other movies, right? What does this say about him as a filmmaker? How does it relate to Goodfellas? How does it relate to, Wolf of Wall Street or something like that? But the context could also be, it could be anything that you're interested in at the moment. So I think, I think if I wanted to, I could probably write something about would The Irishman have been made if Donald Trump wasn't president, right? Because there's a lot of questions in that movie about what it means to be a terrible person who gets away with everything. And I think that, maybe he wouldn't have wanted to make the movie as much as he did if Trump weren't in the White House or something like that, So, and I think it's really important. This is something I tell students when I talk to them about criticism, is it's really important to remember that there's no one correct take. And this sounds basic, but it's people love to fight about movies and things like that. But the fact is, it's art, and my impression of it is going to be totally different from your impression of it. And so what matters isn't whether I have the most correct, take on the movie, but how I see the movie and how I communicate the movie to you. And so, I don't think that a movie is a puzzle to be unlocked that has one solid meaning for everyone. So I like to just sort of put pieces of art together, or put art and current events, or art and things in my life together, and to see what happens when I sort of juxtapose those two things, put them together and see what happens.
And for example, you mentioned something that is really important, because context always matter. It's right now, for example, we have the at least in the United States, it will come later here in Mexico, the release of Jojo Rabbit. And for example, this film from Taika Waititi, it has a premise that perhaps it's something that should raise a lot of eyebrows, because we are he's showing a reality with some aspects that are perhaps not something easy to talk. We are talking about a child who is having some perspectives during the Nazi Germany. But for example, that always depends the way that you are showing, and the way that you are portraying these characters and the surroundings that they have. Perhaps you are not showing them in a way that you're like looking down to them, but you try to understand them and use them, as in this case, as tools to understand a reality. And yes, it's from Taika Waititi. You know that he is going to include some comedic elements in there, but also you will have some perspective that will be exploring, in this case, the human aspects in this. Is not something like to make fun of. It's something to understand, and this is going to help you to understand the reality. And perhaps this film, if it was released during the 40s, during the 50s, it will take perhaps it would have never been made in that case.
Yeah. Sure. yeah and it's and it's important too that Taika Waititi himself is playing Hitler in the movie. And he's half Jewish, and that's an important thing to know going in, right? Because if you don't know that, it might be a little uncomfortable. So that's a movie I've seen it already, and it's very good, and it depends on this time. I haven't read the book, but I hear that it's based on a novel, but I hear that there's no imaginary Hitler in the book at all. That's all added by Taika Waititi. And I think that's very interesting too. If I were still a film reviewer, I would have definitely read the book to compare the two, because I think that's very interesting.
All right, and let's talk a little bit about that. But before that, I want to thank the people who is already connected, joining us in this transmission, like Joel Mesa, like Christian, like Jaime Rosales, like Juan Espíritu. And for example, Jaime Rosales has a particular question. Jaime has also been a guest in this show. With him, we talk a lot about business because he works in the industry. So as you mentioned, it's a different perspective. Perhaps if you are a screenwriter, it's a very different perspective when you are actually trying to sell films. Because even if you don't like perhaps the story, well, your work is not liking the story. Your work is selling this story. So he has one question. Is why do we tend to criticize the audience instead of the final product? And he puts an example. People who hate The Irishman are stupid, or perhaps people who love Marvel movies are idiots. So why do we tend to criticize the audience instead of the final product? That's his question.
Well, I think that that's a great question. I think that the people who do that are not so much critics as they are, or critics of film as they are cultural critics. And I found that whole thing really exhausting. That fight that was going on for weeks about Scorsese versus Marvel. I like them both. I like them both a lot, and I think that you can like them both. You can hate them both. It doesn't matter. So yeah, I think it's easy. I think it's easy to say, it gets clicks if you put up a YouTube video saying that Scorsese's an idiot and here's why. Civil War is better than any Scorsese movie or something like that. I think that it's almost the easiest thing to do. I think that, for instance, when I started reviewing, I tended to be, I was mean. I was a very mean critic, and I wrote some negative reviews that I regret. I was trying to be funny and clever, and so I didn't think about the fact that there were people behind the book, that there were authors, and some of the stuff that I wrote wasn't fair. It was just me going for an easy laugh, and I think that's what a lot of people are doing when they do this. Is they're not trying to responsibly talk about the art. They're just trying to get a reaction, and the reaction is and that makes you feel really good for a minute. You're like, oh, somebody read this and responded, but it's not a lasting good feeling. In fact, it usually makes you feel pretty bad after a while. So I think it's easy, is the short answer after my long answer.
No, and you mentioned something that it's actually really, really important. For example, and I believe that it has something to do with the age that, in this case, the critic or the writer has at the moment at his life when he's writing this. Because when you are younger, you want to feel like you are clever, and you want to have this kind of snappy comment, something that it will perhaps create some more clicks for your page. But also you have to understand the effects of the words. I had a particular case. For example, like 5 years ago, I was part of the talent campus in the Guadalajara Film Festival. They are working really close with the Berlinale. There at Germany, and for example, I wrote some reviews in this case that were published at the talent campus review, and I pretty much criticized a film, a Mexican film, Flor de Fango. It's the name, Moodflower, and sometime later, the director actually wrote to me, and he was telling me that because of the review that I had put into place in the web place, I actually had not destroyed his career, but he was mentioning that it was going to be really difficult for him to find distribution, in this case for the film. We have a very civilized conversation, but for example, in that case, I was like, yes, I wasn't actually trying to make, as we mentioned, some comments for me to make fun about the work of somebody else, but I actually made me realize that I had to be taking into account that, first of all, nobody wants to make a bad film. So if you want to say something like that, there are different ways to tell it. And in a different place, but with the same perspective, Kevin Smith, if you ask him for his podcast, he pretty much never speak bad about different films, because he says, well, a lot of times I have to work with this kind of people, and I know the trade. I know how they are doing, and believe me when I say that everybody's doing their best to do this. And when you receive this kind of comments, when you receive this kind of backlash, well, perhaps you never should take it personal. But you are also criticizing. You can feel it like personal, and it can feel like you are not criticizing my work, but you are criticizing me. Kind of similar to what Jaime was mentioning, that we tend to focus more on the people instead of in this case the films.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Because I don't think that critics should always be positive. I don't think that's interesting if you're always like a cheerleader. Mm-hmm. But I think that that it is important to keep it to the work, and not the person behind the movie, for sure. Yeah, I agree.
All right. So, okay, let's go back a little bit about the reviews. Well, Jaime says thanks for the answer. So, and also, people who are watching in here, you can pretty much read all the comments. They are going to be displayed at the bottom part, so you can see that I am not just inventing with my bots. Yes, I am with my cell phone at this very moment writing the questions to ask myself. Right. Okay. So. For example, you mentioned the way that you have to focus, in this case, on the literary reviews. First of all, you have to write well. It's something that you have to take in account, because, but also you can find some easy ways to discredit, in this case, the reviews. You mentioned one that, for example, if you are misspelling things, well, you don't have the authority. But do you think that it's actually like something like more superficial? Because if somebody is making a comment or a criticism, in this case about a book, let's focus on books, and he's misspelling a lot of things, but the idea is actually something relevant. Do you feel like the criticism still remains important, even if it's poorly spelled or poorly written?
Yeah, I mean, I think that mistakes are always going to happen. Don't I know it? But I think that you know, there was one point, there was one review that I wrote many years ago that a friend of mine was editing for me, and in the review I said that the book was shot through with cliches, and shot through is a cliche. So I was and you know, and that's why editors are great, you know, because they catch you and stop you from making a fool of yourself. It's sorry. So I think that it's I think that mistakes will always happen, and people can take cheap shots at you for anything, but you can't. But I think that I want to do a good job in my writing in general, because I think it makes me more credible. So I do think that spelling does matter in general. And making sure that your writing is pretty good, as good as you can make it at the time, because the writers put a lot of time into these books, and you want to at least give them the respect of showing up in your review and paying attention. You can't pay as much attention as they did, because they spent years on the book and you're spending hours on the review, but you want to do a good job for them, whether you like the book or not, I think, because it's just a certain amount of respect.
Mm-hmm. And for example, when you're reviewing something, let's begin first with books and then with films. How many times do you have to revisit the work to have actually a valid, well, not valid, but an informed opinion? If you read a book and you want to write about it, it's good enough just to read it once and perhaps write something about it, or do you rather revisit, perhaps in case that you missed something, first in case of books and then about movies?
Well, I due to time constraints
okay.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
So I think that due to time constraints, I can only read the book once before I review it, because I review at least one book every 2 weeks on the Seattle Review of Books.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely going to be things that I miss, but like I said, it's I think most people only read the books once, so that seems fair to me, like that I gave it all my attention. I've never reviewed a book that I haven't read all the way through. But and most movies that I reviewed at The Stranger, I would watch them at 7:00 at night, and then I would go home and write a review and send it in at about midnight, and then it would run in the paper the next day. So I would only get to watch those once too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's it's an imperfect system, but it's the way most reviewers work. I don't think most reviewers have the luxury of time to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you watch movies? I wish I could watch a movie like 3 times and then review it. That would be great. Have you ever done that?
But yes, and actually that's part of the question because, and you obviously know about this. Perhaps you can watch a film first when it's releasing on a film festival, and then they are going to have a commercial release. And it happened, for example, for me. I don't remember the name of the film, but the moment that I watched it at the film festival, and it was the final cut. You cannot say that it was a work in progress, so it was an incomplete work. So that's why your opinion changed. But the first time that I watched this film. I remember the name. No quiero estar sola. I don't want to be alone. That's the name. Another Mexican film. And the first time that I watched it, for me, it was like, it's a lot of sensitive stuff in the way that you want to. It's like a lot of touchy feelings, to put it in one way. And I didn't like it. For me, it was like, okay, I understand what the author was doing in here, but it's not my cup of tea. But for me, it was something not relevant. Okay, 6 months later. I had the chance to watch this film later on the commercial release, but for me it was kind of funny because I didn't even remember that I have already watched that film. A friend of mine recommended, so I went, and after the first 10 minutes I was like, wait a minute, I already know this story. Why does it sound so familiar? And after the second watching, I really like it a lot. In this particular case, and you know this, when you go to the film festival, perhaps you can watch 3, 4, 5, even my top was 6 films on a day.
Wow, yeah.
So if you are really tired, you're actually not paying attention. So I believe that in my particular case, for this particular film, it affected me a lot. And in the second viewing, it was exactly the same film, but I got to catch a lot of the intention. I got to understand it better, and I actually quite like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's happened to me. Quite a few times when I do reread something after a long time, or when I watch a movie again, there are 1 or 2 books that I reread every once in a while. The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne is a novel that I reread every few years, and it's really changed. Now as a I think the last time I read it, I was 41, and I first read it when I was 16, and I didn't understand it at all. And every time I read it, it seems like a different book because I'm a different person every time. Mm-hmm. And again, there's no right or wrong way to receive the film, but that's very interesting. I would love to read, a review of the movie the first time and then your review the second time. Even like if you could do a review of your original review, that would be very interesting to me, I think.
Actually, that comes like with the work that you have to do as an editor, because if you are editing reviews for a magazine, for a website, or perhaps for something in the printed media, you know that you have certain time just to check, obviously, the reviews in this case, to adjust. But for example, you don't have the luxury of time to dedicate to work more about that. So in the case of books, mm-hmm. would it matter if perhaps you don't bring the review like as soon as possible when the book is going to be released? Obviously, in a lot of cases, you get the chance of have advanced copies, so you can take your time before publishing. But would it matter a lot if, for example, you could wait like a couple of months? I believe so. So perhaps it's an easy question, but do you think that it would matter for the quality of the review in this case if it's delayed a little bit, or?
Yeah, it might. It might. Like I said, I tend to write very fast, and I do get advance copies months ahead of time, but I usually only read them the week before I write about them. And a lot of the time, I'm writing about them because the author is coming to Seattle. We have a lot of we have quite a few bookstores in Seattle, and we have authors coming to town all the time. And so a lot of my reviews are timed to come out before the event. So I always have a deadline. I have thought a lot about what it would be like if I did take my time with something, but I'm a very deadline-driven writer. So I like to have I like to work quickly. I don't know what it would. I've honestly never taken my time with a review. I wish that I could sometimes. But yeah, it would be interesting. But for me, if I didn't have the deadline, I don't know if I would write, honestly.
Yeah, and one question, since you actually have worked in obviously in various kind of media, but have you actually got the chance to review something that first came in the book and then when it was adapted to the movie, the same book that was adapted? Have you done the review?
Lots of times. Yeah. I read all of the Twilight books and reviewed all the movies. I mean, I think more than I could count. I've done that, and I really enjoy that because that's like mixing the two kinds of reviews together. And and again, I think the easy thing to do would be to say, well, they didn't have this scene in that's in the book, they took it out of the movie, or they didn't include this character or something like that. And that's that's an okay thing to do, but it feels a little easy. I think it's more interesting to think about why they took it out and or why they added a scene in the movie that wasn't in the book, and to talk about that relationship. I mean, personally, for me, the book is almost always better, but that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part to me is usually how it changed and why you think it's changed. Because there's always a reason. Like you said, nobody's trying to make a bad movie. But a book and a movie are two very different art forms. You have unlimited space in a book, and a movie, you are very constrained by time. And so that's interesting. I think looking at it as a puzzle, more of a puzzle than a one-to-one translation, I think is a better way to go. More interesting way usually.
Yeah, and there comes into play the fact that you are the best adaptation are actually that adaptations. If you want to translate something that is written on the page, and you are having perhaps a very descriptive scene where you are mentioning, in this case, how the room is, how the lighting is. Perhaps you can take an entire page if you want to picture something really vivid about a particular scene. But when you're working with images, in this case in the moving pictures, you can do it like pretty much like showing the scenery that you have in there, and it can take you, I don't know, 5 seconds, something that perhaps could take you a couple of minutes to read. So you have to work adapting, and it shouldn't be like just in the case of comic books that were adapted to the big screen. Big screen like Sin City or like 300, that pretty much is a literary adaptation because you are translating from the page to the screen. But you have not you have to translate. You don't have just to project it like that. We have one question from the audience, Jaime, once again, because you mentioned that you read and you also watch, in this case, the Twilight movies. So, are you Team Edward or Team Jacob?
I think Team Edward. Jacob has that whole weird thing at the end where he decides he's in love with a baby. It's just like not comfortable. So Team Edward, and I think he's a great actor. I really liked him in The Lighthouse is a movie that he's in, Robert Pattinson, and he's going to be Batman. And I think he's a good actor.
Yeah. He has actually done quite some work. I remember High Life, which was one of the latest films with him released here in Mexico. The El Faro, it's going to be released, I believe, in January the 1st here in Mexico. So we have something to watch in there. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more about the work that you have been doing. And you mentioned the Seattle review of books. You have a lot of people in here, obviously reviewing a lot of works. We were actually showing some screens before about your latest text in here. Johan Stoberok, I hope I am not mispronouncing his last name. Yeah. Wins La Salle Storyteller Award. So, what's the kind of content that we can check in here? Obviously, besides reviews of books, because you also have news and you have more information, right?
Yeah, it's book news, reviews, and interviews relating to Seattle. Mm-hmm. The 3 U's. We also run a poem by a local poet once a week, and among other things, we have a lot of news items. We review at least 1 book a week. We run an interview with a local author or a visiting author once a week. We highlight 1 event for each night of the week, which is on the screen right now. Because there's so many literary events in Seattle. You could go to 6 different events in one night here. So it's basically sort of a one-stop shop for all the goings on in Seattle, as well as reviews of books, not necessarily from Seattle, but just, we like to say, from a Seattle perspective. So we have different reviewers. We have different columnists. We have the sci-fi columnist named Nisi Shaw, who wrote this great book called Everfair. And we have a romance columnist, and we try to cover sort of a broad spectrum. We have an advice columnist. We have different cartoonists who work for us. And so it's really sort of a broad overview of what it's like to be in Seattle, which is one of the big literary cities in the world, I think.
Nice, really nice. So there you have it, people. In case that you want, if you're traveling to Seattle, if you're obviously living in Seattle, it's I believe that an excellent reference in this case about the literary events and pretty much everything that you can see about what you can read and the places that you can go about this. But for example, and here is the next question, Paul. Mm-hmm. Your experience about writing and about the way that you can see the work of other people. Did it change your perspective when you were writing some of your latest work? In this case, I want to mention Planet of the Nerds because, well, it's something. It's a series that it was a fresh breath of air. It was something really refreshing with perhaps some concepts that we have watched already, but with a perspective that it was really, really interesting. So when you were writing this story and collaborating with Alan Robinson and with Felipe Sobreiro, did you were thinking perhaps about the way that it could be received? In this case, perhaps about us reviewers, or were you, how was your process in this case in particular?
I didn't think a whole lot about how it would be reviewed. And I still haven't read reviews of it because I don't do well with compliments. So a positive review would make me blush, and a negative review would live in my head forever. So yeah, I did not think about how it would be reviewed. When I wrote that book, I was thinking about the kind of book that I wanted to read, and it didn't exist, and so I wanted to write that book. So it was coming from a different spot in my brain than my critical side, I think. And also, one of the things I love about comics is it was a group effort. It wouldn't exist without the great Alan Robinson and Felipe's amazing coloring. So that's one of the things I like about comics is it's by no means all me, just because I'm the first person to work on the book because I write the script, but it wouldn't exist without them, and it wouldn't be good without them. So I don't have any desire to write a novel or to be a literary, to be a poet or anything like that. Comics to me feels a little different. It feels like it's a different kind of writing entirely than what I do on the Seattle Review books. So it's hard to describe. I've never really been able to put it into words. It's a completely different method practice to me than writing in prose.
And also, it's kind of interesting because in this particular case, in the form of comic books, at the moment that you are creating a story in a collaborative medium, you actually are getting the feedback or the review, to put it in one way, from your collaborators. So perhaps, I don't know how was the process in particular, but you were writing something about the first page of the first issue, and the feedback that you could get from Alan Robinson, it could come in the way that I really like it and I'm going to show it this way, or perhaps your idea is good, but I'm going to show it in this way to try to direct to this different aspect of the story. So you kind of have this kind of feedback.
Yeah, that collaboration is very interesting to me. It's super. It was always wonderful to getting a page back from Alan, because it was just it would always be different than what I pictured in my head, but it would be better. And it would always, I would have an idea in my head of what it might look like, and Alan would always do a better job. And the coloring was the same way. It just kept getting better and better. And in a way, it was sort of a, because Alan wasn't drawing the first issue, he started drawing. We brought him on board after I wrote the first script. And so, but once he started drawing the characters, it really informed the way that I wrote about the characters. So there was sort of a give and take and a collaboration there in the creation that felt a little bit like, it's a little bit like criticism, the way that he was interpreting the characters, and it definitely affected the way that I wrote the rest of the book in a really interesting way.
All right.
Yeah.
So perhaps one final question in case that let's see if the audience has another question, but while we wait for that, one final question, because we have talked about in this case, comic books, about the work that you have been doing with this magnificent series. We have mentioned about the work that you have been doing in reviewing books, films, and also food. So and we mentioned about revisiting, perhaps when you have the time, revisiting something like a film or like a book, and how it can change your perspective. Have you, at the moment that you were doing sandwich reviews, to put one example, did you have the chance, or perhaps you were thinking like, have you tried to review a sandwich in a different occasion, something like that, in the case of meals? I have a column that I do every once in a while in Seattle Review of Books where it's called Lunch Date. And what it is, sometimes we get a lot of books in the mail, free books in the mail from publishers who want us to review their books. And I don't have time to review them all. Like I don't know if you could see this. That's all stuff that is to be read. And I'm not going to live that long. So sometimes I will grab a book that I'm kind of interested in and take it with me to a restaurant and sit down and read the first couple of chapters over a meal. And so I was like, oh, why don't I review the restaurant at the same time that I reviewed the beginning of the book? And I'll go to places that I like to eat and try the meal with the book, and it'll change the experience, and sometimes the way that I feel about the food, I think affects the way that I feel about the book. So it's all it's an interesting way to remember that there is no single way you're never going to experience. You can't stand in the same river twice, is a saying, right? Like you can't eat the same meal twice, even if you go to a McDonald's where the same food is made the same way every time. You're going to bring something different to it. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about reviewing is a review, work of criticism is you plus whatever art you're reviewing. And I think that's amazing. I think that's a collaboration that doesn't get enough attention. I don't think that people
give reviewing enough respect. And I think that I'm really going off topic. So yes, you can't eat the same meal twice, and that's great. And I'm all for reviewing things and re-reviewing things and eating things and re-eating things.
So there you have it. Perhaps there is not that much of a difference, not only on different mediums, in different objects of
Yes, yeah. Maybe I'll try eating a book next.
Well, you know that there are phrases like you can eat your own words, so in this case you can print and then prepare some soup or something like that. All right, so we're pretty much getting to the end of this talk, this conversation with Paul. In case that people want to perhaps read a little bit more about the text that you are publishing, I believe that it's really easy just to follow you on Twitter. You are, as your secret identity, you appear as Paul Constant. Is that correct?
Yep. At Paul Constant is my Twitter handle.
All right. There, you also have the different links for your work in politics, in books and comics, and you have the different links that we were mentioning for the serial review of books. They can find you in there in the section from writers, and then they can find most of your text in here. In case that they want to read something about storytelling, believe me, I recommend. The trade paperback has been released this week, I believe, or recently, for Planet of the Nerds. There you have the cost, and believe me, you can find it also in digital, but it's always better if you find the printed edition. And also, in case that you want to find something from the way back, for something, a blast from the past, you can find more reviews about some of the films. I was checking, Paul, something that perhaps it will be kind of interesting later review about the text from Hot Tub Time Machine 2. Perhaps it's a film that not a lot of people have taken into account, but since it's really easy to find this kind of films in places like Netflix or McFarlane USA, which is something like really cool, or What We Do in the Shadows. It's also fascinating, I believe, when you have the chance to watch the film, perhaps a film that you didn't realize was released, in this case in 2015, and then find the reactions from the people back then. So there you have the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will do that. I'll watch an old movie on Netflix, and then I'll go back and read other people's reviews at the time, and that's a really interesting way to consume a movie, because I always like to listen to a podcast after I watch a movie, because it feels like you're taking part in the conversation. So hopefully people will find some of those old ones. Hot Tub Time Machine 2 was a very bad movie, but I loved the first one, I have to say.
There you have it. So actually, well, don't worry. For example, when talking about this kind of films, I am a huge fan of the Charnado series. So don't worry, I won't criticize your preference about films. So. All right, so thanks to everybody who was joining us in this conversation. Thanks to Jaime Rosales, who was really active on the conversation. Muchas gracias, Jaime, and especially. Thanks. Paul, thanks for your time, for your knowledge, for your patience, and for everything that you shared with us. It was a really a wonderful pleasure to have the chance to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
All right, guys, and remember that tomorrow we're going to leave the audio downloadable version for this show. It will be available in Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and all the different sites, and also will be available in the different video sites. Right now we're in Periscope and in Twitch, and in YouTube, and tomorrow we will add the Facebook version in case that's the channel that you prefer. Once again, thanks for all the support that is being given to this show through Patreon. If you like this kind of content, you can get access to more of this kind of content, a lot of interviews that we have in both English, Spanish, and some with some words in German. You can find it at www.patreon.com/churros y palomitas. Once again, thanks everybody for your time, and once again, Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
All right, and here comes the credits.